Hello and welcome to Media 7, recorded at the Classic Comedy Club in Auckland. In this week's program, we're exploring a perennial minefield, the media and suicide. And later in the show, we'll look at Auckland's media campaign to invite the rest of the country to drop by. It hasn't pleased everyone in the big smoke. But first, we'll look at a new documentary by Juliet Weber, who set out to depict the South Auckland you generally don't see in the media.
Aorere College, a school in Mangere, South Auckland, and the setting for Trouble Is My Business, a documentary by filmmaker Juliet Weber.
And I grew up in Remuera, and I had often read about South Auckland in newspapers and, you know, in the media, but it was often quite negative. And I just thought, well, I'd really like to know where that all comes from and what it's really like there. And I wanted to do an in-depth documentary that looked at the causes, you know, like the social issues behind the headlines.
Juliet worked at a women's refuge, an emergency housing provider, and finally at the school.
I rang Aorere College and I asked to volunteer there, and they actually said, well, funnily enough, we've actually got a 7-hour-a-week job. It's an arts coordinator. Would you like that job?
The doco, which we're unable to show because of an agreement Juliet made with the kids, followed assistant principal Mr. Peach as he dealt with kids having difficulties.
The truancy, he dealt with the discipline and anything to do with the students. That was his job, and I just thought he's a great subject for a film because he's my way into the social issues. He had a kind of anger about him, he wanted those kids in class, he wanted them succeeding.
Mr. Peach always gave us options, like opportunities, like he never just turned his back on us.
Alicia was one of the students in the film. She found the process hard, but trusted Juliet and her mission to show the real South Auckland, one that doesn't appear in the media.
I only see bad stuff. That's all I ever see. Gang-related place, you know. They sort of make it look like we're America, sort of, like the ghetto, like the ghettos in America, but it's not like that. It's not as bad as that. Like they're trying to make other people that are not from South Auckland, like look down on us, and you know, kind of like lower class, sort of. Not all of islanders are in gangs. There are some that are trying to be successful and stuff, but that's never shown. It makes me feel like I need to better myself and prove that that's not all we are.
It takes a brave school to open itself to 6 months of filming. Mike Williams is the principal.
It was a very difficult decision, a huge risk for the school really, and for us to really open up the school and I suppose our souls to the documentary, and so we had to think really carefully about that process. A wonderful story to be told and something that we're really keen for people to learn about, the passion, the commitment in our schools.
When they tell me that they're going to university now, the kids that were really struggling in my film, I just feel so proud of them. Like, you know, like that's so awesome that they're, you know, they're making their own journeys in life and, you know, they're succeeding.
That report compiled by Simon Pound, and Juliet Weber's film has achieved the rare distinction of a national cinematic release. It opens in the main centres this weekend. Now, news often deals with the difficult and the distressing. When someone takes their own life, it is both those things. Sometimes it's in the headlines, sometimes between the lines. But where does the public interest lie in reporting suicide? How should it be reported and when? Joining me to discuss the issue are Clive Lind of Fairfax Media, which developed its own set of protocols, the reporting of suicide, after an industry-wide attempt founded. Nettie Cullen, a psychotherapist who specialises in suicide prevention, and Merrin Statham of the group Suicide Prevention Information New Zealand. Welcome to you all. Clive, could we start with you? I've been looking into this. There's been a debate about getting up an industry-wide code of practice about reporting suicide for at least a decade. Why did it fall over? Why didn't it happen?
I think it probably got off to a bad start around 1999 when the Ministry of Health put forward a code without really much input from media at all. So there was a bit of a withdrawal at that point. But then we did start to talk again, and through the early 2000s, we had Jim Tully from the University of Canterbury leading a debate and discussion between the various parties. It went reasonably well, and we felt strong enough to actually get through the Media Freedom Committee to get some sort of protocols going. And then towards 2004, 2005, it just suddenly stopped again. Fairfax at that point thought sufficient progress had been made to continue and discuss it with their own editors, and we largely picked up what the Media Freedom Committee had done and wrote our own protocols. In fact, it is pretty well word for word what was decided at the time, or what was considered to be a pretty good protocol at the time, and that's what's been in existence since then.
Is there any prospect of this progressing on to be that industry-wide code?
Well, I think in the last few years things have got really better again, and at the moment there's some research going on through the Ministry of Health, and I learned today there are likely to be further discussions with the Media Freedom Committee, and therefore, which represents radio and television and newspapers throughout the country. So I would be hopeful that towards the end of this year we will be moving forward again. But in the meantime...
Now, you mentioned Jim Tully's 2004 paper,
yep,
which I have here. One thing that comes through quite strongly in that is the antipathy towards the 1998 Ministry of Health reporting guidelines. What was so bad about them?
I'm not too sure that there was anything so wrong with them. It was just that it was felt there was no consultation, that it didn't really understand where the media was coming from on some issues, and the media wanted to actually talk about some of the things that code had put in, and felt it should have had the right to do so.
Well, was it a natural response? I mean, journalists will always react poorly when a government agency says, no, you can't say that. Was that part of it?
Probably there was part of it, but there was also a genuine attempt wanting to talk about what should be reported. We are very constrained under the Coroner's Act about what can be reported about suicide, and we felt there should have been more discussion, and in fact there are ways forward that we could have contributed far more to it.
The Coroner's Act 2006, which replaced the 1998 one, basically that says you can't report anything until the coroner has made a finding of suicide, and then even after that it's pretty much name and address, isn't it? Is that unduly restricting for you? It
is. It is a very restrictive act, and there are lots of really good things that could be reported, or not good things that could be reported, positive things that could have really good outcomes in the community. But it is a restrictive act. But having said that, I don't want to make any excuse, because reporters still can cover suicide stories, and that's what the code explains, and how they should follow it, how they should, and all the topics they need to take into consideration when you're looking at suicide, which is a very serious topic.
Well, perhaps we should look at why there needs to be a code in the first place. Nettie, your job involves dealing with at-risk people. What, in your experience, is the impact on those people of media reporting about suicide? Do you see a direct impact?
The impact depends on the individual largely, but what I see that people do is they will take what they see in the world around them and they'll apply it to themselves in one way or another. So people who will hear a report about suicide and either perhaps feel very understood and feel like there's other people out there who share their struggle. And
so their feelings are validated by it?
To some degree, for some people sometimes. And for other people may well feel more alienated because the story that they hear or the way that it is reported might make them feel more out on a limb, more isolated, more misunderstood. So it depends very much on the individual, what's been going on for them, how they interpret what they see in the media, what they read, and how their families and the people around them respond to that as well. The thing that I am aware of is I do a lot of training in suicide intervention, and people, family members, neighbours, doctors have all kinds of responses to suicide that influence how they then go on to talk to people who may be vulnerable, and their views are significantly shaped by the things that they see in the media. Yeah.
Is that, I mean, we're mostly talking about the news media tonight, but every now and then the issue will come up of, say, songs that talk about suicide. What do you think the impact of those is? Because they're often presented by the same journalists who want to write about suicide as being particularly damaging.
I think that's an interesting point, because there are songs that have been so familiar to us all of our lives we don't even realise that they're about suicide. The theme song from MASH, for instance, most people don't even contemplate that that's what it's about. I think that many people just enjoy the music. I don't think it gives the same kind of message, in my experience at least. Movies are something different, and fictional portrayals on TV are also something different. So they're a little bit more obvious, a little bit more, individuals can relate to that a little bit more.
They see themselves as the character, which
yeah,
is
but
potentially dangerous.
Potentially, but when it's real life stories, I wonder if the potential for identifying even more is heightened, because they see this is not just a person, a fictional portrayal of somebody, but this is somebody who actually lives and breathes and walks around the city that I do.
And yet, in the end, we can't do without either fictional or real life characters. They surround us, they're part of the media. So what do we do?
That's a really good question, and it's a really tricky balance, because if we don't ever talk about suicide and we don't ever grapple with it, then the risk is that we further stigmatise and shroud the whole topic in mystery, and nobody feels like they can ever talk about the S word, and that's problematic too.
No, perhaps we could bring Merrin in here, because we had an interesting conversation before the show about the word that people were saying to you. That word was taboo. They felt that there was a taboo, or that you were there to enforce one. Clearly you're not. What did you make of that?
When I hear the words commit suicide, it links very directly to the notion and the time when suicide was illegal behaviour. And that language can tend to drive people experiencing those feelings to not want to talk about it, because it further stigmatises their experience. We see a lot in print media in particular, and listen on news media about the taboo of suicide. I think that as a sector, we've moved a long way past that, and I think that most people have a very clear understanding of the fact that suicide must be discussed, and it does need to be discussed. And I want to underline the fact that it's not talk about it, not talk about it. It's how do we talk about it safely that doesn't contribute to further suicide risk. So how do we do that?
Because I mean, there's clearly, you're talking about a lot on your website. It's a very useful website. There's a lot there.
Good.
So what's the keynote to the way you've done things on the website?
What we've tried to do is organise information into specific audience groupings, and so we have quite a way to go with that. We have at least 6 more audience groupings to come onto that website, but suicide prevention information needs to be targeted at specific audiences. So the information that we provide for people who've lost someone to suicide is completely different than the kind of information that we're providing to clinical practitioners or people who work in community organisations who come across people who are at risk of suicide. We want them to know how to respond to those people safely, quickly, and so that it's going to minimise all the risk that is apparent in that person.
So that's a rather difficult task for you, Clive, isn't it? In the media, you can't differentiate your audiences that way. You're talking to one big audience, aren't you?
That's true, but it has been done, in my view, successfully by the likes of the Dominion Post last year, I think it was, and before that, the press. So you can tackle the topic, and that's where, by following the protocols, you can get in the detail that needs to be in there, so that you do have an accurate, balanced account that takes into account many of the features that Merrin's just been talking about. So is it common practice, say, when one of these stories comes up, to have someone like Merrin on speed dial and call her? I would like to think so, that sort of thing happens, because one of the elements of the protocol is the last thing, is consult reputable sources when seeking comment on suicide. So I would like to think that does happen. I can't speak for the entire group, of course, but I'd like to think it does happen, that we do go to reputable sources, and all those elements of balance and accuracy above all comes into it. Do you get listened to when you call, say if you call a newsroom, you call an editor, do you generally get a good hearing in this country?
More so now. Certainly over the 7 years that I've been doing this work, the environment has changed quite considerably, and I want to back Clive up on that more journalists are calling us before they go to print, mostly print media at this point, although we certainly get a lot of contact with radio, but it's the print media that people have the opportunity to really check over before they do it. And much better engagement. There are far more journalists who are aware of the opportunity to talk to someone about how they pitch their story rather than whether to or not. Certainly if we thought that in the interests of the people involved it wasn't a good idea to pitch the story, we'd try and talk those issues through. But generally we try to steer people towards, if you just focus on this and amplify that and try to avoid these kinds of things, we end up getting a good story.
Well, perhaps after the break we can talk a little more about who's reached by the various media, including particular risk groups, but we do have to take a break now, so we'll be back soon.